Mr. President.
I recognize the great senator from Iowa.
Yeah. Today, I'm here to again speak about the New York Times' anti-whistleblower reporting. Obviously, it's very misleading. In a January 18th, 2026, Glenn Thrush, Alan Foyer, and Adam Goldman gave another big wet kiss to their fired friends from the Biden Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they did so in an effort to intimidate, to smear, and to discredit brave and patriotic whistleblowers. This has now become a pattern of conduct by the New York Times, dating back to articles starting in 2023. On January the 30th, 2025, Alan Foyer and Adam Goldman mischaracterized my and Senator Johnston's Arctic Frost disclosures by saying, quote, "Messages showed that the FBI investigators took normal bureaucratic steps and precautions," end of quote, when opening the case. Now, was this supposed to be an opinion piece on behalf of terminated FBI agents or a real news article? Normal steps weren't taken. As I noted in my February 3rd, 2025 floor speech about FBI agent Thibault, quote, "Does the New York Times truly believe that it's normal for an assistant special agent in charge to prepare case predication for the opening of an investigation and then feed it to a street agent? Is it normal for an assistant special agent in charge responsible for the most sensitive political investigations in the FBI to be forced to resign for partnership on the job or partisanship on the job, and then be found to have violated the Hatch Act for that same partisanship?" End of my quote. These two New York Times articles are merely examples out of others that could be addressed with the same rebuttals. So in the interest of time, I'll only address the January 18th, 2026 article that I came here to discuss with my colleagues. In that article, Thrush, Foyer, and Goldman issued the same slobbering defense of fired FBI agents whose emails Senator Johnson and I made public. So who does the Times end up attacking? They've chosen this senator, and they've also chosen to attack my whistleblowers. First, Thrush, Foyer, and Goldman did get something right. Can you believe that? They said the FBI is producing records, quote, "in response to long-standing inquiries by Republicans on Capitol Hill," end of quote. The House and Senate have finally begun to receive responsive productions to our oversight request, as the New York Times has correctly stated. Some of those requests date back many years. Indeed, some requests date back to the first Trump administration. This isn't a scandal the Times would like to create. The Justice Department and the FBI have an obligation to respond to congressional inquiries. To Attorney General Bondi and FBI Director Patel's credit, they've done better in that regard than any of their predecessors, both Republican presidents and Democrat presidents. Now, am I fully satisfied? Of course not. But Bondi and Patel deserve credit. And if the Biden administration had done the same, I would be given the Biden administration credit as well. By and large, the records I've made public this and the last Congress are directly from whistleblowers in unredacted form to which my office applied limited redactions. Or the records are from government in response to whistleblower disclosures that I have shared. There's been examples this Congress and last where the government had no idea what records were in the files of the executive branch of government until I transmitted whistleblower disclosures to that same executive branch. The most recent being the email about an FBI agent wanting to criminally investigate Elon Musk. This, too, is not a scandal that the Times would like to imply, because that is called good government oversight, and I have done good government oversight all my career in the Senate. Second, the Times said I called the raid at Mar-a-Lago, where the FBI reportedly searched the rooms of the First Lady and Barron Trump, a miscarriage of justice. Of course, when the Times said that, they didn't include my full tweet. They left out the beginning of the sentence where I said, quote unquote, based on the records. Those records showed that the FBI agents had many concerns about the raid and, quote, will not do, end quote, the search warrant unless the deputy director provided direction. And the law provides that the deputy director must be involved in that. These are records that were uncovered or were covered up by the Biden administration. Indeed, the public ought to know and give credit to those FBI agents for expressing their concerns and doing it in writing, in other words, following what the law requires. I gave the same credit to FBI agents who were obstructed by their leadership and then Secretary of State John Kerry during the Obama administration. For example, at that time, I released a majority staff report just last year. That report made public FBI emails that showed agents tried to arrest high-level Iranian, but were stopped from doing that arrest. Those agents were stopped then from doing their job because of political considerations relating to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that President Obama was so intent upon getting finalized. And lastly, I released records this year showing FBI agents wanted to investigate election matters, but were obstructed. Those agents created an investigative document that was suppressed in part because the information would contradict then FBI Director Wray's testimony. The records show real frustration among FBI rank and file. Again, I made this information public to inform the American people and also to give due credit to those agents standing up for their work and following the law. Now, relating back to the Times article, the third issue to raise is that Thrush, Foyer, and Goldman did something unforgivable. That unforgivable thing was their article essentially accusing my whistleblowers of violating the law. And it does so in part by citing to a complaint filed by J.P. Cooney and Molly Gaston. These were two of Jack Smith's partisan prosecutors, prosecutors with a mission to put President Trump in prison when he was a private citizen between his two terms of office. J.P. Cooney and Molly Gaston reportedly accused the whistleblower disclosure of violating grand jury testimony when I obtained 197 of Jack Smith's subpoenas, wide-ranging subpoenas that violated the privacy of a lot of people, including a lot of members of the Senate and Congress. So Senator Johnson and I then made these subpoenas public, almost 2,000 pages of information, and that information exposed that Jack Smith, the prosecutor, and his team targeted over 400 Republican individuals and Republican and conservative organizations. In some case, Prosecutor Smith and his team sought communications with the media and the legislative branch. J.P. Cooney and Molly Gaston were a part of Jack Smith's team. So that reported complaint that they filed against my whistleblowers is littered with a lot of conflict of interest. But let's focus on this. Prosecutor Smith and his team sought communications with the media. Instead of the New York Times investigating and reporting on that major constitutional red flag, the Times brushes it aside and gladly runs with the false accusations from Cooney and Gaston against my whistleblowers. And in doing so, the Times also linked a 2020 Justice Department opinion memo to the article to try and support Cooney and Gaston's whistleblower chilling efforts. But the Department of Justice was scoped to, quote, leaks to the press of confidential information concerning prosecutorial decision-making, end of quote. The whistleblower disclosures were to Congress, not to the media. The same Department of Justice opinion also says in footnote number 2 that a separate statutory provision exists that, quote, protects disclosure to Congress using significantly different language and raises distinct issues that we don't discuss in this opinion, end of quote. The same Department of Justice opinion also says in part that an employee is provided whistleblower protection, quote, when the employee reasonably believes that the disclosure reveals a violation of law or rules or exposes serious wrongdoing as defined by statute, end of quote. Thrice, Foyer, and Goldman opinion piece fails 3 ways. They misled the public by creating a false narrative that whistleblower disclosures provided to me and Senator Johnson were somehow illegal. Moreover, a fundamental precept of whistleblowing's the First Amendment. I thought the New York Times and its left-leaning compatriots loved the First Amendment. Here, in this January 18 article, the Times shreds the First Amendment and in doing so undermines and devalues patriotic whistleblowers. That's a historic disgrace that'll age very poorly for these authors, their editors, and the New York Times at large. The January 18th article also argues that my critics say these whistleblowers won't face reprisal because Trump's in office. Reprisal isn't a conditioned precedent to be a whistleblower. And how dare the Times make any insinuation that my whistleblowers haven't put themselves at risk. Whether there's a Republican or Democrat running the White House, whistleblowers always face real risk, ruining themselves professionally, losing their job, all that and more. And my whistleblowers have faced years of risk because their disclosures to me have occurred over a period of years, not just during the Trump administration. Here, too, the Times and the authors try very hard to undercut the assertion that why whistleblowers are protected by law. It's an act done to chill, to intimidate, and smear patriotic government workers. In closing, perhaps the most disappointing element of this article is the quote from the Government Accountability Project. The Government Accountability Project is a group that I've worked with for decades on legislation and whistleblowers, and I consider them a very fine organization, not only helping whistleblowers, but helping all of Congress in our responsibility of oversight to see that the executive branch faithfully executes the laws according to the constitutional requirement. Government Accountability Project said this to the Times about my whistleblowers not facing any risk of reprisal. Quote, "There's no risk, given that it looks like the entities who ordinarily might retaliate apparently might be behind the release, end of quote. This is a shameful statement for the New York Times and their authors to make. So my office approached the Government Accountability Project, and this is what they told us. First, the Government Accountability Project apologized. They said about the New York Times article, quote, it's not something the Government Accountability Project wanted to have our organization part of, end of quote. Second, the Government Accountability Project said the quoted employee, quote, is a contract lawyer who isn't authorized to speak for the organization beyond his clients, end of quote. The Government Accountability Project asked the Times to make that correction, but, quote, unfortunately, they declined, end of quote. Third, the Government Accountability Project said it didn't stand behind this statement as it, quote, violated Government Accountability Project standards because it was speculative rather than evidence-based, end of quote. Fourth, the Government Accountability Project said the quoted employee, quote, didn't know the context when a reporter asked him a hypothetical question and has promised to check before any future public statements that could overlap with Judiciary Committee work, end of quote. So, I hope it's clear. It appears that based on Government Accountability Project's representations to my office, the New York Times misled the Government Accountability Project employee to get a quote, as you could expect, that would fit the Times' predetermined narrative. So much for following the facts and the evidence as you would expect any journalist to do. The Government Accountability Project also submitted a letter to the editor in support of this senator. I thank the organization for doing that. What really shoddy work by Thresh, Foyer, and Goldman. Thanks to these three reporters, the New York Times is a paper of record when it comes to attacking and undermining whistleblowers. So I say to my whistleblowers, I will defend you, I will protect you, I'll continue to make public the records that you're giving to me, and so to the New York Times. Shame isn't a strong enough word to describe these unprofessional articles. I yield the floor.